Tim Grayson had always known that living near an HOA was like teasing a wild animal, but he never imagined it would go so far as to ruin his prized tractor. Yet there he stood, staring at old Nellie, her engine so choked with sand she might as well have been a dune in the Sahara. That tractor, the faithful machine that had plowed his fields for years, was now deader than his cousin Eddie's old pickup truck. Tim had a hunch about who was responsible, and it pointed straight to Margaret Ellison, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood's HOA. For the past 6 months, she'd been on a crusade against anything she deemed an eyesore, and Tim had already been in her crosshairs twice. Once for parking his truck too prominently in his own driveway, and once for leaving his porch light on after 10 p.m. She was the type who probably alphabetized her spice rack and reported stray cats for loitering. But this was next-level spite. Tim rubbed a hand over his face, frustration boiling up like a pot of stew left too long on the burner. He turned the key one more time, just to confirm, but old Nellie only coughed out a gritty groan before falling silent, a sound like the last gasp of a loyal companion. "Damn it," Tim muttered, kicking the dirt. He scanned his property. No one around, but he could practically smell Margaret's meddling. She'd been dropping hints for weeks about tidying up his land, griping that his tractor clashed with the neighborhood's visual harmony. He'd figured she'd try something petty, but sabotaging his equipment? That was bold, even for her. Fuming, Tim stormed back to his house, flung open the door, and made a beeline for his security monitor. He'd installed cameras after her last HOA stunt, not because he'd expected to need them, but because something about Margaret screamed escalation waiting to happen. Sure enough, as he rewound the footage to the previous night, there she was, Margaret, sneaking onto his land like a possum with a vendetta, dragging a hefty sack behind her. The video showed her dumping sand straight into old Nellie's engine, and then, unbelievably, she did a little victory shimmy before strutting off like she'd just robbed a bank and gotten away with it. Tim's blood pressure spiked to levels that'd make a doctor wince. This wasn't just HOA nonsense anymore. This was vandalism, pure and simple. Without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and marched down the street to Margaret's pristine McMansion, a house so spotless it probably repelled dust on principle. He didn't knock. He hammered the door like a debt collector on a mission. When Margaret opened it, she had the nerve to feign surprise. "Oh, Tim," she cooed, cradling a mug that read laugh, lead the HOA, "what brings you here?" "You poured sand in my tractor's engine," Tim said, voice flat. Margaret blinked, then let out a tinkling laugh that made Tim's hands ball into fists. "Tim, that's a wild accusation. Maybe you should take a breath before you say something foolish." Tim whipped out his phone, flipped it toward her, and hit play. The footage rolled in crisp detail, showing every damning move she'd made. Her smile twitched, just enough to betray her. Oh my," she stammered, pressing a hand to her chest like he'd accused her of treason instead of catching her red-handed. "Well, that could be anyone." Tim stared at her, then at the screen, then back at her. "Margaret, you danced." She huffed, puffing up like an offended peacock. "This is ridiculous. Even if, and I'm saying if, that's me, you can't prove anything. The HOA board won't side with you. You've been a nuisance since you moved in. That tractor's an eyesore. I did everyone a favor." Tim took a slow, deep breath, the kind that kept him from punching a wall. "You just admitted it." "Please," she scoffed. "It's my word against yours. And honestly, I doubt you've got the cash to fight this. Tractors aren't cheap, Tim. Maybe next time, hide your scrap heap." That was it. That was the moment Tim decided Margaret Ellison wouldn't just pay for his tractor. She'd rue the day she crossed him. He gave her a long, cold stare. "I'll see you in court, Margaret." Then he turned and walked away, tuning out her smug little chuckle. She thought she'd won. She thought he'd back down, grumble a bit, and let it slide. She was about to learn that Tim Grayson didn't let things slide. Back home, his mind raced. He had the footage, the proof. Now he needed a lawyer. And he knew just the one. Carla Jennings, a local legend who dismantled HOA despots with surgical precision and a pit bull's tenacity. She was the kind of attorney HOA busybodies feared in hushed tones. If anyone could turn Margaret's life upside down, it was Carla. Tim grabbed his phone, a grin breaking through for the first time that morning. "Carla," he said when she picked up, her voice sharp and all business. "I've got a case for you. You're gonna love it." There was a pause, then a slow, gleeful laugh on the other end. "Tell me everything." And Tim did. When he finished, Carla let out a low whistle. "You've got video? Crystal clear? Oh, this is gonna be a blast. Let's bury her." Tim leaned back in his chair, savoring the thought. Margaret thought her HOA crown made her untouchable. She had no clue what was coming. The courthouse smelled of stale coffee, dusty books, and nervous anticipation. Tim sat on the plaintiff's side, arms crossed, watching Margaret play the saint. She sat ramrod straight, her pearl earrings glinting under the harsh lights, looking every bit the innocent victim. But Tim knew the truth, and soon, so would everyone else. Beside him, Carla Jennings was a whirlwind in a sharp gray suit, her fingers drumming on a legal pad she probably didn't need. She'd taken down HOA tyrants before breakfast. Margaret was just another notch on her belt. Across the room, Margaret's lawyer, a twitchy guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, fumbled with his notes, glancing at his client like she was a live grenade. The bailiff called for order, and the judge, a grizzled man with weary eyes, cleared his throat. "Let's get this over with. Timothy Grayson versus Margaret Ellison. Mr. Grayson, you're claiming the defendant deliberately sabotaged your tractor, causing damages requiring a full replacement. Correct?" Tim nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned to Margaret. "And you deny these claims?" Margaret clasped her hands and flashed a saccharine smile. "Absolutely, Your Honor. This is all a misunderstanding." Carla smirked beside Tim. Margaret's lawyer gulped. The judge sighed, clearly wishing he were on a golf course. "Fine. Plaintiff, present your evidence." Carla rose, her heels clicking with purpose. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A, security footage from Mr. Grayson's property, recorded the night before his tractor failed." She handed a flash drive to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Margaret's face stayed composed, but Tim caught the slight clench of her jaw. The video played on the courtroom screen, and there she was, Margaret, creeping onto Tim's land in the dead of night, hauling a sack of sand, pouring it into old Nellie's engine, and then, absurdly, doing a triumphant little jig before sauntering off. The room went quiet, save for a stifled snicker from the back. Tim kept his eyes forward, letting a tiny grin tug at his lips. The judge peered over his glasses at Margaret, exasperation dripping from his voice. "Mrs. Ellison, care to explain this?" Margaret straightened. "Your Honor, while that might resemble me." Carla snorted loudly, and Margaret glared before pressing on. "There's no proof I caused any damage. That tractor was ancient. It probably died on its own." Tim's jaw tightened. Old Nellie might have been vintage, but she'd run like a dream until Margaret's stunt. The judge rubbed his temples. "Are you saying someone accidentally dumped sand into the engine the night it broke down?" Margaret folded her hands. "I'm saying there's reasonable doubt." Carla stood again, her tone smooth as a blade. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B, footage from a neighbor's camera, showing the defendant returning home that night with sand on her shoes." Margaret paled slightly as the second video rolled. There she was again, caught from another angle, sand trailing behind her like a guilty shadow. Tim wondered if she'd ever considered how dumb it was to wear white flats for a crime. Margaret's lawyer piped up, voice shaky. "Your Honor, we argue that intent must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt." The judge cut him off with a look. "Are you suggesting she tripped and spilled sand into the engine by mistake?" Margaret pressed her lips shut. Tim glanced at Carla, who was practically purring with anticipation. "Your Honor," Carla said, "Mr. Grayson seeks $40,000 for a replacement tractor, plus $10,000 in punitive damages. Given the evidence, we think that's more than reasonable." Margaret let out a shrill laugh. $10,000? For that old junk? He could have just hosed it out. Carla turned to her, all calm menace. "Mrs. Ellison, you didn't just annoy my client. You wrecked a vital tool he relies on. That tractor wasn't a lawn ornament. It was his livelihood. You destroyed it on purpose." Margaret's grip tightened on the table, panic flickering in her eyes. The judge sighed again. "Mrs. Ellison, this court finds you liable for the damages. You'll pay $40,000 for the tractor and $10,000 in punitive damages." This is an order, not a request. Fail to comply, and we'll enforce it. Margaret's face went ashen. You can't be serious. The judge's glare said he was deadly serious. Her lawyer slumped, defeated. Tim leaned back, a warm wave of satisfaction washing over him. He hadn't just won, he'd crushed her. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret whirled on him, venom in her voice. This isn't over. Tim smiled. Oh, it is. And with that, he walked out, victory in his step. But something told him Margaret's collapse was just beginning. Margaret Ellison unraveled faster than a cheap sweater. The gavel's bang in court had shattered her HOA throne, and she'd stormed out like a hurricane of indignation. Tim had hoped she'd take the loss with some grace. He'd misjudged her. Word of the trial tore through the neighborhood like a brush fire. Margaret, the tyrant of curb appeal, the guardian of picket fence perfection, was now a proven vandal, and out 50 grand for it. The HOA, long cowed by her reign, smelled blood. At the next meeting, which Tim didn't even bother attending, they ousted her in a landslide. His neighbor Bill, a retiree once fined for overly festive holiday lights, called Tim cackling. Apparently, when Margaret tried to justify herself, someone yelled, "Was sandbombing the tractor for the community too?" The room had exploded, and the vote was unanimous. Tim thought she'd slink away after that, tail between her legs. Nope. Margaret doubled down with petty vengeance. First, his mail started arriving late. The carrier, a no-nonsense guy named Pete, said Margaret had been hovering by the mailboxes, ranting about certain residents ruining the neighborhood. Then she started parking her car just close enough to Tim's driveway to be a nuisance, not illegal, but irritating. Tim didn't bite. He'd back out slowly, waving cheerily every time he caught her glaring from her window. The breaking point was a fake HOA violation notice taped to his mailbox and signed, unofficial, and accusing his porch light of breaking some imaginary rule. Tim read it, laughed until his sides hurt, then marched to Margaret's door. When she answered, he held up the note. You know you're not in charge anymore, right? Her face twisted. You're a blight, Timothy Grayson. You wrecked my tractor, he shot back. She sniffed. That's debatable. Tim sighed, amused. I was going to let this go, figured you'd learn something. But if you want to keep poking the bear, fine. You owe me 50 grand, Margaret. Maybe save your energy for that bill instead of playing these games. Fear flashed in her eyes. Losing the lawsuit was bad. The debt hanging over her was worse. She slammed the door. Tim chalked it up as a win. A few days later, he saw a for sale sign in her yard. It hit him slowly. Margaret, the neighborhood's self-crowned dictator, was leaving. Whether it was the money, the HOA revolt, or the shame, she was done. Tim didn't feel a shred of pity. She'd earned this. A week later, as Tim set up his shiny new tractor, courtesy of Margaret, his buddy Sam strolled up, grinning like a fox. Heard about Margaret? Sam asked. Tim leaned against the tractor. If you say she skipped town in disguise, I'm all ears. Sam laughed. Not quite. She's selling the house. Already saw that, Tim said, smirking. You don't know who's buying it, Sam said, pulling keys from his pocket and jingling them. Me. Tim blinked, then roared with laughter. No way. Dead serious, Sam said, beaming. Got it cheap, too. She was desperate to bolt. Tim shook his head. So she pays for my tractor, gets booted from the HOA, sells her house, and now you're her neighbor? Priceless. Sam slapped Tim's shoulder. I'm planning a tacky gnome army for the yard. Maybe some pink flamingos. Might paint the place lime green just to twist the knife. Tim wiped a mock tear. Sam, you're a treasure. The day Margaret moved out, Tim sat on his porch with a beer, watching the movers haul away her pristine furniture. She didn't glance his way as she got into her car, her face hard, lips pinched tight. She'd lost, totally, irreversibly, and Tim had never felt so content. As she drove off, Sam wandered over with a beer of his own. So, Sam said, nodding at the new tractor, what's this one called? Tim thought for a second, then grinned. Vengeance. Sam snorted. Perfect. They clinked bottles, watching Margaret's car vanish down the road, taking her HOA tyranny with her. Tim took a sip, leaned back, and sighed. Peace at last.